Welcome to the Washington Examiner's Book Club. Thanks very much again for joining us. Today I am going to be talking to Christopher Scalia, author and senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, whose new book is 13 Novels Conservatives Will Love, subhead, but probably haven't read. I'm fortunate that of the 13, I think I've read 5, so I'll have at least some ability to discuss these with you. But Christopher, what I wanted to ask you first about is that you mention in the introduction there's a limited range of books that conservatives cite when you ask them the books that they've read. And is this particularly a conservative phenomenon, that their range is their range limited because they're conservatives, or the range of things that they appreciate because it appeals to them as conservatives limited?
I think that conservatives probably assume that there are only so many novels available to them, so they tend not to drift off that beaten path, because they assume most novelists are going to be far left weirdos who write things that have no appeal to them, or their ideas are just completely foreign from their own. Of course, that doesn't make it a bad novel in and of itself. But I think also because that relates to also the fact that conservatives might be having found that limited set of books that's kind of good enough for them. That's enough of a canon, and they can mine enough there. And the books that are in that category I mentioned, like Brideshead Revisited, one or two novels by Ayn Rand, or 1984, Brave New World. I don't mention Dostoevsky, but he would certainly fall in that category. My point is not to discourage conservatives from reading those novels, because for the most part they're great. Rather, to recognize that there's a lot more out there, that novels that are exceptional literature, that also explore ideas that conservatives are interested in sophisticated ways.
One of your predecessors at AEI, Michael Novak, 20 years ago began and for a short while ran seminars in the evening, because he felt like the conservatives focused too much on economics and sort of government efficiency. Not that they were necessarily very good at those things, but nevertheless, that those were the sort of preoccupations of the conservative movement. And he felt that that the conservatives had ceded the culture to the left. Was it part of your intentional motive with this book? Is there a certain sort of filling in the gap, filling in the space to try and make sure that conservatives don't do that?
Yes, absolutely. And I think over the past 15 years especially, conservatives have been more aware that they've been ceding culture to progressives. Andrew Breitbart's admonition that politics is downstream of culture, I think really resonated with conservatives. And I don't know if it's that simple. It's more like political and cultural whirlpool. They mix together. But I think conservatives have been more conscious about engaging with culture more, whether it's in universities, setting up alternative learning institutions, but also in television and cinema. But with literature, I think maybe we're lagging a little bit. And so what I hope my book does is introduce conservatives to great literature they didn't know about, that helps them think about conservative topics more thoroughly, but also might inspire a couple of novelists to show them how you can grapple with these issues in sophisticated ways and create great literature.
We'll go on to some of the specific content of the book in a minute, but I wanted to ask you a question which is sort of about the general sort of the reading culture, because there's been a steep decline in reading, let alone reading of good literature or even just fiction. Do you believe, is it your belief that one can't really be fully who one's supposed to be without literature? Is there, is it, and is this a problem? Talk a little bit about the lack of reading in the American society.
Well, it is depressing how much reading has dropped off in the last 40 years in particular. I think in the early 80s, the NEA did a report, and something like 50% of adults had read a work of literature in the past year, and that number has dropped today to the I think the low 40s or the high 30s. So it's a precipitous decline. And it's easy to see why. There are so many distractions out there, so many things to do other than read a novel. And But I think it's a problem because very aggressive defenders of the arts and humanities say that the arts make us more human. And I don't want to go that far, but they do help us understand what it means to be human. They help us understand human nature more fully. In the case of fiction in particular, they help us understand, great novels help us understand how different people think.
Right.
Great novelists like one I include in this book, George Eliot, in particular, really get us inside the heads of characters, not so that we agree with them necessarily, but we understand their ways of thinking and how one thought can lead to another and how those thoughts can lead to particular actions. It's an exercise in sympathetic imagination that's really, it's healthy for citizens in a democracy.
There's an aspect of that which you do, in fact, you deal with in the introduction and indeed in the book. But trying to encourage reading in part because of the benefit that it can give you in terms of understanding other people can make it seem like medicine rather than candy, therapeutic rather than aesthetic. I mean, that's something which you deal with, but in fact, certainly going back to the age of Johnson, which is where you begin, there was always this idea that books should be not just enjoyable, not just aesthetic creations, but moral examples.
Yeah, Samuel Johnson is the first writer I discuss in this book, and he was writing when the novel was still a novel form, and his big concern was that the primary audience was the young, the ignorant, and the idle. And so as a result, novelists needed to be very careful about what they depicted because their readers would be picking up lessons from those novels. I think novelists tend to worry about those issues less now, but I think there's no doubt that we pick up lessons from what we read, either to reject or to embrace. And that's I think an unavoidable element of the arts in general, but especially literature. But to the way you introduced that question, literature should not be broccoli. Once you know how to read a novel, and once you find novels you really like, you understand how to enjoy literary fiction. Other forms of fiction are more immediately enjoyable. Literary fiction is a little bit more challenging sometimes because the characters are a little bit more complicated, a little more human, I think, and the writing is more elevated. But those are also sources of the enjoyment. The great literary fiction is a source of wonder, beauty, enchantment, and joy. And those are things that are wonderful in their own right, even apart from the lessons you may be picking up.
You mentioned the suggestion that literature can make us fully human, and there are ways in which the literature kind of has that sort of elevated aspect to it. And I'm always reminded of the Gospel of John, which is in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. There is something about the word and as being absolutely fundamental to who we are and how we understand the spiritual.
I think that's right, and that's one of the frustrating elements of the lack of reading now is by not reading the best that has been thought. You do not. We lose a familiarity with and consciousness of just how wonderful the English language is. And what it's absolutely capable of. If our reading is restricted to tweets, Instagram posts, and things like that, and we're not reading people who are really expert with the language, we underestimate what language is capable of.
So I'm just going to remind the viewers that it's 13 novels conservatives will love but probably haven't read, Talk a little bit about how you chose which books you were going to include in this. And I asked this particularly in the case of one of the books that you chose is Daniel Deronda, George Eliot, which I have read and have to say that it was not by any means my favorite. And whereas Middlemarch was an absolute masterpiece, which I thought was perhaps one of the greatest books I ever read. So why did you choose the books you chose, or what were the criteria that you applied for choosing?
Well, to some degree, the subtitle, but probably haven't read, is a key to all of this. I wanted to select novels that people, they may have heard of the authors, like George Eliot, but may not have had these novels already recommended to them. So I don't write about Jane Austen, for example, because I think Jane Austen, people should read Jane Austen, but
Right.
people have enough people already telling them to read
Right.
Jane Austen.
Right.
They didn't need me to do it. Though I still do that, but I just don't devote a chapter to her. I wanted novels that were a little bit off the beaten path, for the most part by familiar authors. Now, in the case of Daniel Deronda, Middlemarch, I think, is the better novel. But Daniel Deronda has a particular plot line that I think will surprise readers, and so it is one of its central. It has two central plots. The one involving the title character, Daniel Deronda, is about creating a Jewish state.
Yeah.
Over the course of the novel, he discovers that he's Jewish, and this gives him a sense of duty and purpose in his life, and that purpose is to help establish basically a Jewish nation state.
Yeah.
And Eliot wrote about that idea in essays, or in one essay anyway, after this novel. So it was really important to her. So she wrote about it in a nonfiction way, but here she's trying to fictionalize, to humanize that particular mission or purpose for this character.
It was extraordinary that, and you reminded me in the book that that Daniel Deronda came out about 20 years before the first Zionist Congress,
and Eliot wasn't Jewish, which is also
Eliot was
remarkable.
not Jewish, although as a philosopher, her mind extended to these ideas, and it kind of goes to that idea that in some ways the sort of association of the people, the idea of nationhood, even the idea of nationhood in the United States, is to some extent owes something to the idea of a people, the Jews being in a place, Israel. But so I want to go to almost to the other end of the spectrum, from the very overtly serious discussions of Daniel Deronda, of serious subject matter, to what is at least ostensibly just very light, and that is Evelyn Waugh's Scoop, which it has that sort of bright hardness that Evelyn Waugh has, and it features a character, William Booth, who is a sort of an ingenue in Fleet Street, who is mistakenly sent to Africa. And one of the things about this book is that it seems very relevant now to a time when we keep discussing journalism and the news media's inclination to tell a story, to have a predetermined narrative, rather than to write what is actually going on. And that is exactly what William Booth, the central character, is told to do by the proprietor of the Daily Beast, not the modern Daily Beast, which other people have known, but from which the modern Daily Beast gets its name from this book, to go out to Africa. And although it's uproariously funny, and I think that the description of the Ishmaelite constitution is perhaps one of the most funniest sustained piece of comic writing anyway that you'll find in the English language, nevertheless, it lampoons as it were, the vanity of the imperial toil, doesn't it?
It does, absolutely. So going back to your previous question, why I selected some of these novels, they all explore some idea or theme or concept that are especially important to conservatives. And sometimes those are kind of high-minded ideas, like the enduring human condition, the consistency of human nature across time and place. In the case of Scoop, it's just that conservatives really like making fun of reporters and the media. Liberals do too, but especially conservatives. And so Scoop, as you said, it is uproariously funny, but there are really serious overlooked elements to the novel. So as you just mentioned, it pokes fun at European colonial ambitions. I think it would be too much to say it's a post-colonial novel, but it recognizes kind of the ineptitude of these European nations. And I think this is arguably a Burkean concept. Their attempts to map their ways of life and their political goals onto a well-established country with interests in a culture of its own. And then also there are some really important points about language. And in my chapter, I connect Scoop to Orwell's writing, much more serious writing about the misinformation, as we would call it now, of the media and the dishonesty of language. And in Scoop, Waugh pokes fun at just bad writing.
Yes.
But it's closely related to, there's also a lot of groupthink in there that connects, I think, very closely to a lot of what Orwell warned about in 1984 and in his nonfiction as well.
Right, right. There's one of the things that comes through in many of these novels that the first one discussed in the book, Rasselas, Samuel Johnson, A Bend in the River, is that it is a characteristic of conservative thought that it doesn't believe in that it checks utopian.
Yes.
The utopian urge. It accepts, as it were, the fallen state of humankind. And whilst that is not written about as a prescription for a lack of effort, but it is a sort of tempering understanding. So that in Rasselas, the prince of Abyssinia goes out looking for a life that the perfect life, sort of, that he can choose, and eventually he decides to go back where he came from. In A Bend in the River, which is V.S. Naipaul's one of a really wonderful 20th century book, and which I happened actually to read when I was living in Sudan. So there was a certain sort of relevance there. It is about civilization and being something which holds back barbarism. That there is the fallen state of man.
Yes.
We're never that far. We're always a long way from being perfect, and it's only a kind of arrogance that suggests we can be perfect, which is a sort of more left-wing thing, I would say, and that the conservatives are always aware of the man's trouble being civilized.
There's another novel that I include in there that I think falls in the same category, which is the American author, in this case Nathaniel Hawthorne's Blithedale Romance. And that too is a warning about what William F. Buckley, his admonition, don't immanentize the eschaton. Very clever, funny, and Buckleyan way of saying, don't try to make heaven on earth.
Right.
And yes, it is a very conservative idea that because human nature is constant, you need to respect what came before you, not because it was everybody who came before you was perfect and knew everything, but because they faced the same challenges you did, and they may have fallen short in some of their ideas and their policies or whatever, but they were. Chances are they did what they did for good reason, and to throw everything. It's the Chesterton's fence concept. When you come across a tradition or an institution, before you throw it out, you need to consider why it's there. Why was it initially constructed? And I think that's a very conservative impulse. It doesn't mean you can't reform. Doesn't mean people cannot progress, but it implies a kind of humility to those changes. A few times I mentioned Thomas Sowell's phrase or aphorism, there are no such thing as solutions, only trade-offs. And I think that's a very conservative way of thinking. Every policy change is going to have unintended consequences that might improve what you were looking to improve, but it's kind of a game of whack-a-mole. Something else is going to pop up somewhere.
You also quote Roger Scruton, the late and great Roger Scruton, several times. One of the things that I remember when he was a friend and we talked about, and one of the things that he often said was that the past is not just, it is actually an inheritance.
Yes.
And it's in a way an inheritance that is formulated on the old-fashioned ideas of being entailed to the next generation as well. We have a duty to the past and a duty to pass on traditions to the future generations, rather than like Pol Pot or the French Revolution, is starting from year zero and having the arrogance to think that we know better than them all. And that's a consistent theme that comes through here.
And Hawthorne especially, his narrator becomes part of an agrarian commune, and they think they're going to be able to establish a totally new way of life and throw out all of the misguided policies and beliefs of the past. And very early on, he realizes how deluded he was, and that the generations before him thought that they were capable of the same thing too, and fell short. And there's certainly an element of humility there that's, I think, important to conservative thought.
So, Christopher, that's where we're going to leave it. I'm delighted that you could come and join, and thank you very much indeed. I want to remind you finally that it's 13 novels conservatives will love, but probably haven't read. It will add as many as 13 new books to your bookshelves. You should also put this one in your bookshelf. Chris, thanks very much for being with me, and thank you all for being with me too.
Thank you.